notes. So the first one is when you started about Aristotle. It occurs to me that if his final ethical judgment of our existence is the aim of happiness, surely that happiness is the opposite of unhappiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if there's something there in terms of something lost in translation,
Mm-hmm.
or whether Aristotle was just wrong. Because if happiness is seen as something as the opposite of unhappiness, it means that the pursuit of it will inevitably bring desire, the desire for happiness, and therefore suffering. And the second thing I was considering is about these objective values,
Mm-hmm.
well, in art, for example, in that I would say they do exist, but the fact that different people might be affected by a beautiful artwork in a different way. So some, as you say, will be completely unaffected, some very much so, and for some it will be like a, medium range experience. That does not necessarily negate the possibility that that artwork has objective values, but it merely points out that the viewers come from not perhaps necessarily different cultures or different times, but there are different stages of their ability to perceive
Mm-hmm.
those kind of objective values. So, as Schopenhauer posits, as you say, that there is a genius in all of us, but the amount of that genius varies. I would say actually that could support this kind of idea that there is an objective value, but it is just perceived in a lesser way or more intensively. Not necessarily just by different individuals, it could be perceived in a lesser amount at one stage of life, and then we suffer, we grow, we understand more, we are more sensitive to those kind of experiences, and then we react in a different way to the same artwork that maybe we have seen some time ago.
Okay, first question, was Aristotle wrong? It's very difficult to prove Aristotle wrong because he's the only one in history in philosophy, for example, which was called the philosopher. Everybody else is quoted by his name or surname, but when you say the philosopher, that means only one. Now, was he wrong? He, as I said, he sees three different types of life, and he was very detailed philosopher. He was not only philosopher, he was a biologist, astronomer, mathematician. He was just even more than that famous l'uomo universale of the Renaissance. He was even more than that. Now, he says that three different types of life, and every life will aim for certain good. So that first one, which is sensitive, which he calls bovine, right? Like animals, majority of people will just worry and see happiness if they have enough to eat, shelter, food, procreate. That's it, right? So they wouldn't suffer. They wouldn't read, they wouldn't educate, they wouldn't learn languages or sciences or whatever. They wouldn't do that because they would just aim for those things. Then you have the second one, which is political life, in which you aim for recognition. So you're going to do everything to please your society. You're going to do everything to get at timos, recognition. But that the goodness is not in you, is in people who recognize you. So the possessor of the good, Aristotle says, is others, is not the active subject. And then you have a contemplative life. You have life of people who are, later Nietzsche would say, who will struggle all their life, who will never stop, will never be 100% satisfied. He says, what is noble, Nietzsche says? He says, to live happiness to the majority. Right? So happiness is easy to reach if you are, according to Aristotle, in the first category of human being. Nietzsche doesn't, who needs happiness, he says. He sees in suffering, he sees a challenge. You overcome suffering in order to reach satisfaction. But the moment you overcome suffering and you reach the state of satisfaction, you want another suffering. So you never stop. You never reach that end of happiness. This is why he says so many times, choose your enemies. Better the enemy, sweeter the victory. Choose your sufferings. Constantly put the goals in front of yourself. Because we are simply unstoppable creatures. Only humans can do that. We can enrich ourselves. I mean, enrich by meaning of inner wealth. Unlimited. Nothing is stopping nobody. Everybody stops himself at a certain point. So where you're going to stop yourself is entirely up to you. If you want to follow Schopenhauer or Buddhism, you may stop. You may try in your life to repudiate all your desires. You are going to avoid all the sufferings. Problem solved. You don't need desires. Now you're like artist. You finish one painting, and then what? No, you're not finished. You're going to do another one, and another one. And for the rest of your life, you're going to chase that suffering better, bigger, more challenging. This is what Nietzsche talks about. Aristotle is very clinical there. He says, this lot doesn't want suffering, is going to be satisfied with much less effort, much less suffering. Fine. This lot in the middle is going to suffer a bit more, needs social recognition. This lot at the end, they're going to suffer a lot. But they will reach that happiness, which is different, is contemplative, is inner.
Can I add something on that?
Sure. Sure.
So, I think you said something that was lost in translation, didn't you?
That's right.
Right? You're correct, because the Greek term eudaimonia, I don't know if they actually pronounced it in that way in ancient Greece, is not, happiness is the simple translation, doesn't really get the flavour. And another way of interpreting Aristotle is to see Aristotle as encouraging us to fulfil our potentials. And looked at like that, it's not that much different. I mean, it's not that dissimilar from Nietzsche. And a lot of the self-fulfillment movements or self-actualization movements of the 60s and 70s in California could be said to be as much influenced by Aristotle as they were by Nietzsche. And I think, if you don't mind saying so, there's another aspect to Nietzsche that you didn't mention, which is the will to power. And I think...
I had to stop somewhere.
Yeah, you have to stop. But I think both for Aristotle and for Nietzsche, one of their similarities is that our fulfillment is down to our natures. So very often, the way that a lot of ethics and political and ethical thought works is, what is human nature? So Aristotle's idea of human nature is saying, what is the function of a man? And Nietzsche's, I might paraphrase, what is the function of the Übermensch, perhaps? I just throw that in as a little semi-joke. But both of them, I think, were promoting self-fulfillment or self-actualization. So
Yeah, but I mean, Aristotle thought it was an objective self-actualization, whereas Nietzsche thought it was subjective. Yeah. The translation these days is usually flourishing rather than happiness.
Yes, yeah, flourishing or fulfillment.
Oh, what's it? Flourishing.
Flourishing, yes.
Yeah.
And it's not clear that Aristotle thinks that there is such a thing as an individual subjective notion of flourishing, nor I would say that I think is exactly collective. But because he sees human beings as rational animals with a goal, with an end, that I may be miscarrying him slightly, but I would say that probably his thought process is that there is something like an ideal flourishing to which everyone can strive, everyone can have flourished or not have flourished, But it isn't. I don't think Aristotle would agree with Nietzsche that it is simply a matter of designing a life that you want to live, but rather that somehow in your blood or in your body or in your nature there is a life that if you have lived it, then you have lived it well, and if you have failed, then you have failed to live it. But it's not really a matter that you sort of design it as such. But I think that one can interpret Nietzsche as a subjectivizing of the philosophy, like this identical kind of policy. But Nietzsche says, no, you're not rational. There is no rational end. That very framework is an illusion. You have to design your own similar trajectory yourself. But it's not clear that either are right or either are wrong to me, anyway.
So what do you think? How do we decide what is good, what is not?
Well, I mean, wasn't the point of Nietzsche to move beyond what is good, right? For him,
But he failed, right?
Well, but
We're here.
but isn't it? I mean, you said it in yourself that good has meant different things at different times, and that's what I understood Nietzsche's.
Yes, Nietzsche's perspectivism. I can't open every subject of his, like will to power, for example, is another one. But perspectivism means exactly that.
Yeah.
That there are only perspectival views. Not one, not absolutistic, not absolute right, absolute, but it's perspectival, which is individualistic. And Nietzsche is an elitistic philosopher. He doesn't care. He says morality of the herd should remain in the herd. He's fine with that.
Again,
He's not saying it should be cut.
Bovine like is almost like Aristotle's
Yes.
way, isn't he?
Yes,
Really.
yes.
Bovine multitude is Aristotle.
Aristotle is also, he's not as drastic and radical as Nietzsche, but he's also very surgical when it comes to flourishing, right? Flourishing of a carpenter is one thing, but of a philosopher is something else.
But I think Michael was right when he in shorthand
Sounds
said,
like name.
Because now and again.
Miloš, you can.
Now and again.
If you wanna film it.
Let's get on to the point.
It was to do with the point about Nietzsche is that the responsibility is on us to decide for ourselves. So I think in a sense,
Yes.
you know, Nietzsche's a precursor to the existentialists in that way. So the point is that for us to rise above the bovine masses, as it were, it is our responsibility to do it. It's our decision. So the Übermensch is somebody who decides for themselves. I kind of agree with you about aesthetics. I don't think aesthetics is the whole of it. I think aesthetics is not the only way one could fulfill oneself as an Übermensch necessarily. So I think it's
It is.
a way of.
It's not a way. For Nietzsche, there is not a way. And he says in Aphorism 219, Gay Science, he says, what is needed? I mean, this is his philosophy in a nutshell, really. It's probably the most powerful aphorism. What is needed? He says, to give style to one's character. To give style to one's character. He says, a very rare and fine art, which is pursued by the ones who are ready to discover their strengths and weaknesses, and then give them an artistic plan in which even the ugly will please the eye. I mean, this is 1,000 pages can be written on this single aphorism, and it's not even the whole aphorism. It's only maybe first few lines. So to give the style, one has to be satisfied with himself, says Nietzsche. Otherwise, we have an enemy. What it means to give style? Style is purely aesthetic. To organize your strengths and weaknesses and give them an artistic plan in which even the ugly will please the eye. There is no other way.
So you're claiming then that therefore there is some kind of objective means. If you're claiming
Where?
that if you're saying this is the way of.
No, I'm saying that Nietzsche said, what is needed is to give style to one's character.
Okay.
To one's character.
No, I'm not
What is
but-
objective in
but-
one's? Now I'm just following the syntaxis, the logic of the sentence. To give the style to one's character. Very rare and fine art. Rare means not many people will do it. Fine means, wow, this is something that is not really everyday's thing. But then practice only by one who are able to reach to their strengths and weaknesses. Who is the one who looks for his own weaknesses?
Well, Aristotle,
I don't many.
Wouldn't Aristotle say almost the same thing, which is to say that you as a rational animal have your strengths and weaknesses, and if you want to flourish, you ought, I mean, even Socrates would say the same thing, of course, that you ought know the might of your own body and the strength of your own mind, and you ought to compensate for your own weaknesses. And the objectivity is in the objectivity of those things. I mean, people actually have strengths and weaknesses. One can't design one's strengths and weaknesses. One has to accept the fact of them. I mean, even under Nietzsche there, you can't take an ugly person and have them pretend they're beautiful. That is to deny their nature, right? So there has to be an
No,
objectivity
you
of
can't
nature.
do that, but that person has to do that with himself.
Correct.
There is nothing that is nothing external with Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not a model maker. He's a perspectivist.
He may also be a hypocrite.
Anything.
Correct.
But as you said, precursor of existentialism.
But, okay, my point is this.
Absolutely, yes.
My point is this, that for some people the aesthetic might be the ultimate way of fulfillment.
Okay.
But I'm not sure that's true from a Nietzschean perspective for all.
No. He's not. I said it already. He's not an elitist, egalitarian philosopher. Nietzsche is concerned about higher people.
No, you misunderstand. I don't mean for all that what I mean is some Ubermensch might be the aesthetic, for others it might be the intellectual and so on. So I don't think there's one goal
No, you
that
cannot.
all Ubermensch would be aiming for. Because if there was, then that would be saying almost like there is this objective thing all people should aim for. And you've argued so far that it's subjective, I think.
No, he's not. As I mentioned, Julian Young, who has made all his philosophical victories criticizing Nietzsche on implementing illusion and therefore failing to justify life in the birth of tragedy. But Nietzsche says clearly, only as an aesthetic phenomenon the world and existence can be justified. Meaning further down the road that affirmation of life is not possible without aesthetic phenomenon.
So would you say
So,
that this
here's-
is that's something that holds for everybody then, or all Ubermensch?
Well, I'm not saying that. He is saying that. Right?
Your
I'm saying that what he's
interpretation
saying.
of
Right?
Yeah.
And what I say is different. But the thing is that he doesn't see rational only, epistemically only warranted world. He thinks it's not possible to justify world only rationally, only with an intellect, because Christianity has failed, Kant has failed, Schopenhauer has failed. He said he has that. This is his inheritance, philosophical inheritance. He tries to defend Schopenhauer in the beginning, but he gets rid of him because it's impossible. You have to. I mean, on the end of the day, look, we're all gonna die, right? And I can make anybody depressed in 2 minutes. Seriously, it's not a big deal. Yeah, seriously, yeah. We are gonna die, suffering, this, that. Life is not worth living. People, there's so many sects and cults around the world. They've proven they're doing that. They convince their members that the life is not worth living, and they commit suicide, all of them, collectively. There are villages in Schopenhauer talks about it. There are villages somewhere in some island, wherever, where people simply kill themselves.
Well,
So,
my experience of those phenomena is that those people believe something more than their life is. They believe the opposite. People
Yeah.
martyr themselves because they believe in an idea too much, not because they believe in life too little.
Yeah, but they are not affirming life that way.
Depends on your point of view.
I
They're not
feel-
affirming their existence, but they may be affirming an idea. For example, under Aristotle's view, it could be an idea for which human flourishing is furthered. In other words, there might be, by pursuing that idea and killing themselves.
Yeah, but
might
that
be-
idea is not life.
Correct. Well, no, it's life of it might be the life of others.
Yeah.
Not
So
one's own, yeah.
the thing is justifying life. Nietzsche justifies life in the birth of tragedy. This is his first step. His philosophical inquiry starts with justification. Why Nietzsche needs to justify life? Why is he so concerned about justifying life? Because he says that in history of philosophy, life is not justified. Life is not worth living. He looks at Christianity. He looks at his father was a Lutheran pastor. He was brought up to be one. He has Christian morality in his little finger. He knows what it is. He doesn't like it at all. Then he sees Schopenhauer. He sees what is the problem. God is dead, he says. In Zarathustra, the madman comes and says, God is dead. And people are looking at him thinking, what are you talking about? Nobody cares. But the problem is, if God died, you have nothing to cling on anymore. You have to start deciding yourself what is good for you to do. And that's the problem. So now we have vacuum. Ossified, traditional, universal, unchangeable, unquestionable, moral of Christianity is gone. There is nothing there. And what happens? Pessimism enters. Nietzsche is scared for the peoples of Europe. He says, he prophesies that because of that pessimistic attitude toward life, because of that valueless life, bad things will happen in Europe. When people have no value, when they don't have moral, ethical values, they're easy to manipulate, to recruit. And guess what happened in the 20th century? Exactly that. Unmistakable prophecy. And I think it's still happening.
Well, I think there's something should be separated out here, which is something I was thinking about earlier, which is the question of identity and character and personality, which is always necessarily an aesthetic question, and ethics, which isn't necessarily aesthetic. Like, in other words, how I conceive my identity, what it is I care about, why I care about it, what I wish and what I don't wish. These things are matters of my own judgment. Matters of my own judgment, and I don't think anyone would have ever denied that in history, like, broadly speaking. Now, in the case of the death of God, what we are saying there is that religious identity, which gave people a sense of meaning or purpose, disappeared, and what we get in the 20th century and to some degree in the 21st is the emergence of political identity taking the place of religious identity, which of course we have another wave of right now in a different, more milder form. But to me, that doesn't say anything necessarily about ethics. It confuses ethics for caring. Like, what Kant was saying, well, Kant was saying quite a lot. But anyway, what, let's say, some ethical philosophers were saying is not so much that let's say, lying is wrong, or therefore you should make a project of your life not to lie. They were saying that if you fail to do so, you are bad, which is a judgment that Nietzsche wouldn't like. But I think Nietzsche is talking about two different things, because there's a judgment of morality of badness, and there's a judgment of identity of badness. And if something offends one's identity, then it is bad because it isn't what I like. But if it's something that offends one's morality, then it might be objectively the case that one is doing a bad thing. So these things are not, Nietzsche wants to make these things the same, it appears, but I don't think that that is accomplished by mere assertion. It is the case that you can design your own life, and it is the case that you can just ignore the fact that you are lying. Who cares? That doesn't show, the very fact of that does not show that what Kant was saying was wrong. It says only that you can do whatever you like if you want.
Well, the difference between them two is that the Kant talks about universal law.
Yeah.
Nietzsche doesn't talk about anything universal.
Correct.
He talks about subjective. Because he doesn't care about objectivism, universalism, egalitarianism. He cares about higher man. And he knows that the morality, which is leveling, as Christian morality, everyone, leveling, meaning you have to choose whatever is common, Nietzsche says, has no good because it's common.
But
Common, what is common? We need a very low common denominator to make something common. To make something average, you cannot aim with high standard because you won't be average. Now the average or common has to have very low standard of judgment. Then the majority will get there. But that will cut the heads of the people who are above that, who are more capable, more talented. That's his concern. This is the ultimate Nietzsche's concern. He is not even concerned in metaphysics, in metaphysical kind of philosophy. He is extremely practical. He is concerned about higher men. But now when you say higher men, some people may say is obviously extremely selfish approach to evaluation. Selfish, right? So let's say Beethoven was extremely selfish. Picasso was extremely selfish. Nietzsche was extremely selfish. Aristotle was selfish. The highest people in this world, we may agree, they were very selfish because they had to do so many things for themselves at that point of time. But now we live because of those selfish people who he called Übermensch. The history of humanity is nothing but history, graveyard of Übermensches. What would we do if we didn't
as
have?
told by themselves.
Not necessarily by themselves.
Or their
Beethoven.
children or their nephews in the case of Aristotle. Nicomancus.
No, we said that now. I can say that now.
No, well, quite. But what I mean to say is, the history of the world, as recorded in books, is not a history of 100 billion people, of which there have been,
Sure.
building 100 billion people's worth of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
because it can't be written down. What is written down by aristocrats is tales of their own aristocratic excellence. So if one looks through the history of what aristocrats said about themselves, one will find a history of great men. That isn't the history of the world. It's a history of the ideas of aristocrats. And it's not a history of the material life of people. And I would say...
Okay, can I stop you there?
Yes.
Then what about history of art? Are the aristocrats?
Correct! Of course, why not?
So what would you like the life that, imagine the other way around, and that the people who were not aristocrats wrote the history.
Oh no, but my point is that history...
No, what would you listen now if you don't have Beethoven, Wagner, Liszt, Brahms, Tchaikovsky? You wouldn't even know about them, wouldn't you?
I think...
I wouldn't change for that world, no.
Well, nor would I, but I think we have to distinguish...
Or Nietzsche or Schopenhauer. So I wouldn't just call them aristocrats, right? I call them geniuses.
Well,
Not because of their... I mean, look, Mozart died like a dog. Van Gogh died like a... They were not aristocrats. Nietzsche wasn't an aristocrat.
Well,
They were worse off than many average people of the day. Far from being aristocrats. But when it comes to their deeds, we can call them aristocrats by meaning etymologically of the word Aristos, which means the best. And I agree with that, absolutely. Aristos means the best. And aristocracy, unfortunately, takes the name from there. And these are, for me, the real aristocrats, not the one who wage wars for material wealth, etc.
I think it prioritizes a certain kind of intellectual life and bourgeois aesthetic and taste and preference, and calls that history. A history of the world, which was a history just of people doing things that they enjoyed, which didn't evolve our culture, which didn't evolve our sciences, but which merely perhaps evolved a little our enjoyment of one another. That would be an alternative history, which would be worth as much as the history of an aristocracy. And I'm not denying the value of geniuses. All I'm saying is to call that our history is to do a great, it's a confusion. The history of the world is a material history. It's a history of war, conflict, conquest. I mean, Aristotle doesn't exist if he was rich. Why is Aristotle rich? Why is Plato rich? It's because of the wars of Athens. And from where did they get their time? From the slaves of Athens, right?
Yes.
So we have to include in the history of all of these great men.
Yeah, but what's wrong with slavery in those days?
Nothing, I'm not objecting to it. I'm just saying that one ought to include in one's history.
That's fine.
That
John Locke invested money, you know where?
Correct.
Yeah, so...
What is it? So is it what way around is it? Is it the great men evolved society, or is it society created the conditions in which those great men had the luxury of idleness?
Nietzsche fights for the problem, exactly what you mentioned just now, that the society is going that way, that is not creating ideal circumstances for production of geniuses.
Correct.
That's his main problem. John Stuart Mill, in his book on liberty, says the same thing. He says, the good society is the one which first identifies its talents and then supports them all the way. That's, for John Stuart Mill, major duty of just society, to identify talents and then supports them.